The tests ended up revealing that there was a lethal amount of arsenic in Stuart's system at the time of his death. Hello and welcome, I hope you are well. Apologies for not uploading for a few weeks, but I'm all better now and hopefully can get back on track. In today's video, we'll be going through the case of Velma Barfield. On the 3rd of February 1978, Stuart Taylor, a 56-year-old farmer from North Carolina, was rushed to hospital after having spent the preceding few days suffering severe abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting and diarrhea. His girlfriend, a devoutly religious widowed Sunday school teacher named Velma Barfield, stayed by his side praying for his recovery until Stuart passed away the same day. Puzzled by the man's sudden death, the doctor who'd treated Stuart suggested an autopsy, which Stuart's adult children gave permission for after Velma told them that if you don't do it, you'll always wonder. At Stuart's funeral, Velma comforted his two children from a previous relationship, Alice and Billy, assuring them that their father was in a better place. Afterwards, Velma's son Ronnie pondered out loud, "You know, it's the saddest thing, but it seems like everybody my mother ever gets close to dies." Earlier that same day, Lumberton Police Detective Benson Phillips was awoken by a phone call at his home. The caller was crying and babbling and therefore difficult to understand, but the detective made out the words, "Murder, I know who did it and you've got to stop her, you've got to stop her." Still half asleep but aware that no murders had been reported in the small town of Lumberton, Detective Phillips assumed that it was a prank call and told the caller to phone him at the station before hanging up. At work he checked, found that as he had thought there were no homicide reports and got on with his day. Then the phone rang. It was the same caller as earlier, but this time she was calmer and more coherent. Although Detective Phillips still had to coax details out of her and she wouldn't give her name. Over the course of the conversation, the caller revealed that she was calling from South Carolina and that the man who had been murdered was the boyfriend of Velma Barfield, who Velma had killed just as she killed her own mother. The caller admitted that she had no proof but was sure that not only had Velma killed Stuart and her own mother, but that they weren't the only ones. Too many people close to Velma had died, she said, including two elderly people whose names she didn't know that Velma had worked for. Eventually, Detective Phillips asked her how she knew about all of this, to which she replied, "Because Velma is my sister." Velma Barfield was born Velma Bullard on the 29th of October 1932 to a poor family in rural South Carolina. However, the family moved early in her childhood to Fayetteville, North Carolina. Her first foray into crime was when she was a schoolgirl. She started stealing pocket change from her father to buy sweets, before progressing to stealing $80 from her elderly neighbour. Her father found out about the crime and beat her for it, which seemed to have the desired effect as she never stole anything else for the rest of her childhood. Velma later claimed that her father sexually abused her during her adolescent years, something which had been refuted by 7 of her siblings who denied that there was any abuse by either parent, at least by the standards of the era they grew up in. Regardless of her motivation, Velma was certainly keen to get out of the family home in a hurry, eloping with her high school boyfriend Thomas Burke at the age of 17. The couple had 2 children and by all accounts seemed to have been happy until Velma had to have a hysterectomy and develop back pain, which led to a change in her behaviour and addiction to Librium and Valium, with her going to multiple doctors for prescriptions. Thomas likewise had a run of bad luck. 15 years after he married Velma, he lost his job and was subsequently injured in a car crash. He began drinking heavily and the quarrels with Velma got worse. Thomas's drinking was an insult to Velma's staunch religious beliefs, and she started hiding his whiskey or pouring it down the sink before finally committing him to Dorothea Dix Hospital as an alcoholic. Thomas was eventually discharged and returned home sober but resentful and sour. The quarrels continued until after a fight on the 4th of April 1969, Velma waited until he had fallen asleep and left, taking the children with her. While they were gone, the house mysteriously caught fire with Thomas still inside it. When Velma and the children returned, they found the house burnt down and Thomas dead. Following the death of her husband, Velma moved back in with her parents. The following year, she married Jennings Barfield, a local widower. 6 months or so after the wedding, Jennings suddenly fell ill following an argument with Velma before dying from what appeared to be a heart attack on the 22nd of March, 1971. Velma moved back in with her parents again, her father dying soon after from lung cancer. In 1971, Velma's mother, Lillian, suddenly fell ill, suffering from symptoms of nausea, vomiting and diarrhea, before recovering after a few days. That December, she fell ill again with the same symptoms, and her condition deteriorated until she died a few hours after being admitted to hospital on the 30th of December 1974. Meanwhile, Velma had started writing bad checks to pay for her addiction to pills, eventually being caught doing so. In 1975, she was convicted of 7 counts of writing bad checks and sentenced to 6 months in prison, of which she served 3. After her release from prison, Velma got a job as a live-in maid and carer for the elderly Edwards couple. The 94-year-old Montgomery was incontinent and bedridden after he lost his eyesight and both legs due to improperly managed diabetes. His 84-year-old wife, Dolly, was far more mobile but was a cancer survivor with a colostomy. At first, Velma got on well with her employers, but after a while, quarrels started regarding the quality of Velma's work. Montgomery's already poor health got worse, and he died on the 29th of January 1977. Velma stayed on to look after Dolly, but the quarrels continued. Just under a month later, she fell ill with nausea, vomiting and diarrhea. On Sunday the 27th of February, she went to hospital at the insistence of her concerned stepson, Preston Edwards. She was treated in the emergency room and sent home the same day. The following day, she took a turn for the worse and was back in hospital on Tuesday, dying that evening. Soon after, Velma got another similar job for 80-year-old farmer John Henry Lee and his 76-year-old wife, Record, who was on crutches after having broken her leg. Again, problems soon surfaced, Velma being annoyed by Record's incessant chit-chat and the couple's arguments. Then there was a check that puzzled Record as she had no memory of signing it. John Henry called the police, but the case didn't get anywhere. On the 27th of April, John Henry fell ill with an upset stomach and diarrhea. His condition deteriorated and Velma called an ambulance. He was taken to hospital and recovered, going home after 4 days on the 2nd of May. He soon fell ill again, his mystery illness following a pattern where he'd be okay for a few days, then cramps, vomiting, diarrhea and cold sweats would start again. His weight dropped drastically. Throughout it all, Velma was sweet, caring and attentive, for which the family were very grateful. Eventually, John Henry took a turn for the worse and Velma called another ambulance for him. He was admitted to hospital, but there was little they could do, and John Henry died on the 4th of June. Shortly after John Henry's funeral, Velma moved in with Stuart Taylor, the nephew of her deceased former employer, Dolly Edwards. Some time before Stuart fell ill, Velma had visited his daughter Alice and asked to see a picture of Stuart that she had taken as a joke. In the picture, Stuart had laid down on the couch, closed his eyes and crossed his arms to emulate the image of a dead man in a coffin. Velma laughed along with Alice and Stuart when Alice had fetched the photo. Following the strange phone call on the day of Stuart Taylor's funeral, Detective Phillips phoned the local hospital to ask about Stuart's death and was told that it was due to natural causes. When he asked if an autopsy had been performed, he was told that one had been carried out, but that they didn't have all the results back yet. Stuart Taylor's cause of death was officially listed as gastroenteritis. Fortunately, the regional medical examiner, Dr. Bob Andrews, thought that an otherwise healthy man like Stuart had died a bit too suddenly from that alone and had investigated further. Finding an abnormality in some liver tissue, he'd sent samples to North Carolina's chief medical examiner for more tests. The tests ended up revealing that there was a lethal amount of arsenic in Stuart's system at the time of his death. The authorities then took a second look at the death certificate of the other people close to Velma Barfield who had died and found that in the majority of cases the cause of death was listed as gastroenteritis. The consistency of the supposed cause of death tipped them off that they didn't just have a murderer on their hands, but a serial one. Following Velma's arrest, the bodies of Jennings Barfield, John Henry Lee, Dolly Edwards and Lillian Bullard were exhumed and samples were taken for toxicology screening. In all 4 cases, lethal levels of arsenic were found in their tissue. Velma Barfield later confessed to the murders of Lillian Bullard, John Henry Lee, Dolly Edwards and Stuart Taylor, but denied killing Jennings Barfield. As far as anyone could ascertain, Velma's primary motive for the murders was avoiding being found out for check fraud using the names and accounts of the victims. At her trial, the defense tried to plead insanity, but no one was convinced and she was found guilty and sentenced to death. As there were no designated prison facilities for holding female inmates on death row in North Carolina at the time, and Velma was in fact the only female prisoner on death row, she was held at Central Prison in Raleigh in an area for escape-prone prisoners and the mentally ill. She proceeded to make her cell into a home, pushing up family photographs along with crocheted knickknacks and inspirational religious slogans. She didn't smoke but kept a packet of cigarettes handy so that she could light one when using her cell's toilet in order to avoid bothering the guards with the odour of her excrement. A somewhat ironic thing for her to be concerned about, considering that her victims had died after suffering terrible diarrhea. While in prison, she quit the pills she'd been addicted to cold turkey and became even more religious than she'd been previously. She spent her final years ministering other prisoners with enough dedication to lead to an unsuccessful effort on her behalf to obtain a commutation to lift imprisonment. Another appeal was made based on the testimony of Dorothy Otnell Lewis, professor of psychiatry at the New York University School of Medicine, who claimed that Velma suffered from dissociative identity disorder. Professor Lewis claimed to have spoken to Velma's alter ego, Billy, who had told her that Velma had been a victim of sexual abuse and that he, Billy, was the one who had killed the abusers. The judge was unconvinced and denied the appeal, Professor Lewis later quoting him as saying that one of them did it, I don't care which one. Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection on the 2nd of November 1984 at Central Prison, making her the first woman to be executed since the 1978 resumption of capital punishment in the USA, the first woman to be executed since 1962, and the first woman to be executed by lethal injection. Her last meal was a bag of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. In a statement given before her execution, she said, I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry and I want to thank everybody who have been supporting me all these 6 years. She was buried in a small rural North Carolina cemetery near the grave of her first husband, Thomas Burke. So that was the case of Velma Barfield. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like it and consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy true crime. But until I see you again, please be safe, be well, and I'll see you next time.